your values are you most afraid to lose? Which ones are most threatened by
freedom
the
of
arrival
speech.
of refugees?
Freedom of speech. It's the first one. Oh, you think that's not a problem?
I mean,
you think that's not a problem?
But
you think, sorry, no. Let me pick up on that. Let me pick up on that. It's
what about the
very
values of
easy to
tolerance,
snigger. It's very easy to snigger about this until you've had friends shot in a newspaper office. It's very easy to laugh about that until it's happened to people you know.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Hope all's good wherever you are. In this video, we're going to be looking at a video from the Doha debates. This is going to be with Douglas Murray, Mark Lamont Hill, and a very, very biased and rude host. They're going to be debating one of the issues that I think is going to be one of the prominent issues in the next American election in November, which is going to be refugees, illegal immigration, migrants, and open borders. The first speaker we're going to be looking at here is a woke professor, Mark Lamont Hill, an American and activist. Let's get into the video. I'll give you my thoughts as we go through. Now,
thank you so much. Good evening to everyone here and watching around the world. I'm excited to discuss this critical topic around the global refugee crisis. As a trained academic, however, I can't just answer a question. I have to say all the things that are wrong with the question before I can answer it. And for me, the question of refugee crisis in the global landscape is itself misleading and problematic. To talk about refugees as a crisis is to ask the wrong question at the wrong time. Rather than beginning with the entirely reasonable question of what do we do with these people who have arrived here, we must first ask an equally reasonable but far more urgent question. What are the social, cultural, economic, and intellectual conditions that led these people to our doors? Before we deliberate about what to do with Mexicans at the southern U.S. border, many of whom assume a de facto refugee status, we must instead consider the trade agreements and exploitative labor practices that actively undermine the possibility of prosperity within Mexico. Prior to wrestling with the question of Syrian refugees, we have to answer the years of American foreign policy, and we have to consider the years of American foreign policy that have helped to destabilize the region. By framing the issue differently, we not only become more intellectually honest, but we're also better equipped to arrive at sustainable solutions. We must address the crisis of citizenship. Today, we very easily and comfortably talk about our respective countries as our homes. We decide, based on the arbitrarily defined borders of the country, who is and who isn't a member of our national community. It's important to remember, however, that the idea of the nation-state is a relatively new one. Prior to the last 150 years or so, our determinations of what made people, who we never actually meet in real life, part of the same community as us, were far more fluid, far more complicated. The difference between us and them, which is so often appealed to when rejecting refugees, is often, though not always, as large as we'd like to believe. To solve the refugee issue, we must first commit to reimagining citizenship in more interesting, dynamic, and practical ways. We must also consider the crisis of memory. Far too often, the people clamoring to close the borders forget that they themselves were beneficiaries of openness, either as former refugees or otherwise desperate immigrants looking for new possibilities in a new land. Rather than closing the door behind us once we've safely passed through the door, we must do the difficult but necessary work of creating sites of safety for those who come after us. We must remember who we are. We must also remember the horrors that have occurred when we have failed to properly tend to refugees. Consider, for example, in the 1930s, when the US and Europe refused to provide refugee status to Jewish brothers and sisters, desperately fleeing Nazi Germany. Our moral failure contributed to one of the greatest atrocities in human history. We cannot repeat such acts of moral indifference and outright evil by failing to remember our mistakes. Speaking of mistakes, we must take seriously the question and the crisis of supremacy. Simply put, we live in a world where we believe that some lives are inherently worth more than others. This belief, undergirded by white supremacy, Orientalism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, allows us to view some lives as worthy of protection and others as disposable. It allows us to see some cultures as compatible with our society and others as an inherent threat to our way of life. This doesn't mean that there aren't real and tangible political and cultural differences that we must consider. We must do that. But even those differences can't be properly understood or reckoned with until we address our core biases. And speaking of biases, we must tackle the crisis of representation, particularly in the media. The media, both traditional and new forms, offers most citizens their window into the human experience. The media shapes how we identify and assess social problems. The media gives us a sense of what our available solutions are. The media tells us whose lives matter and whose don't. As long as we are beholden to a narrow range of corporate media sources, themselves committed to a narrow range of ideas and shot through with the very biases that I just referred to, we will struggle to think outside the constraints of the current moment. So, what do we do? The million-dollar question that all academics hate to answer. We must resist. We must address each of these crises with the belief that organized people can and do defeat organized power. That means we vote, we march, we think, we boycott, we teach, we write, we sing, we debate, all in ways that undermine the current power structure and create the possibility for freedom and safety for refugees around the world. Thank you so very kindly.
Mark Lamont Hill is somebody I don't agree with on most things. He does bring up some good points. The topic of mass immigration and refugees is a very, very complicated one. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution for every country, right? But the fact of the matter is we have to try to find a solution, because if your country doesn't have borders, well, you don't have a country. And what's happening right now in many countries in Europe, like Sweden, Ireland, England, what's happening in Canada, what's happening in America, has to stop. Now, let's take a look at Douglas Murray's opening speech.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you here in Doha. I've been traveling across several continents in recent years, not just to the countries that people are fleeing from around the world, but also to the places they're fleeing to the refugee camps, migrant camps that people end up in. And I've been struck by so many thoughts during this time, but one of them is that there are so many utopian dreams that occur. People dream that you could live in a borderless world on one hand. Other people pretend you could just stop anyone coming. These are impossible dreams, but somewhere in the middle of them is something we need to aim for. And one of the ways I've started to realize that we need to think about this is in the following terms, not about right or wrong or, good and bad. I'm a good person, you're a Nazi. It's too easy. What we need to think about with this is that we're in a situation with migration talking about competing virtues. There are two virtues in this whole debate that are in serious competition, not just between people, but within all of us. The first virtue, I would say, is the virtue of mercy, the desire to be merciful to our fellow human beings who are suffering. And we all feel that. Everybody should feel that. But there is also another virtue here, the virtue of justice. And that's not just justice for people fleeing countries, but justice for people in the countries that they are fleeing to. And we can't ignore those two parts. We need to recognize that's what's going on here. This is why it's so difficult, and the debate goes down the middle of all of us. So look, there are so many questions we need to think about if we're going to address this. And I'm so glad, by the way, this isn't a debate, because this is a very not debatable issue. But why we need to think about this. Let me give you just 6 examples of things we need to think about much more deeply than we have. The first is this. I would suggest it is very obvious that the developing world cannot move to the developed world. So what do we do? Who can come? That's one part of that question. And the second part, which is much harder, who can't? We are very, very bad at having even a bit of that debate, but we need to. Secondly, what are the differences between people fleeing for their lives from a war zone and people fleeing serious, severe economic deprivation in, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa? Now, there are differences, but if you recognize that, then you've got to work out where along the way you would put your line for legitimate asylum claims. A third of people in sub-Saharan Africa polled last year by Gallup said they wanted to move and leave sub-Saharan Africa. So you've got to work out along this way, if you're going to have a sustainable asylum policy, who qualifies for it. And I would suggest we're not very good at having that discussion either. A third point. We know that some cultures find it easier to mix into other cultures than others, but we don't know exactly how. And we don't know what the proportions of people are in another culture that work well, integrate well, adapt well, and what the proportions are that start to make that integration, that adaptation far harder. We have thought very little about this, and what thinking there has been pretty bad. Let me give you another example of something we need to think about. How do we deal with a question this serious in the age of social media? An age when a single photograph of a single person can go all around the world, and everybody sees it, and everybody says something must be done. And their politicians think, I've got to do something. And then they do something, and the public say, no, that wasn't the something we were thinking of. We've thought of something else, but we don't know what. How do we live in that world? How do politicians act in that world? How do we have any form of political leadership in that world? How do we work out what the right thing to do is in that world? Not just in the short term, but in the long term too. Let me give you a fifth question. How do we ensure that we're able to have a serious and deep debate about these issues, and that we're able to allow people to express legitimate concerns and have that debate without those legitimate concerns being dismissed as xenophobic, nativist, and so on? How do we work out where that might be the case? And how do we work out where it's not, where there are legitimate fears? Sixth question, how do we overcome fatalism? Fatalism you hear everywhere these days, sometimes in the spirit of optimism. This is the world as it is now. People move. This is globalization. Get used to it. Suck it up. Don't complain. How do we get used to that? How do we deal with that? Now, I've got, rather unsurprisingly, fewer answers than I've got questions. But let me give you just 3 answers I would suggest that we could hold on to as the beginning of a set of answers to this. The first is, hold a very clear line between people fleeing for their lives from war zones and people fleeing economic deprivation. Find and hold to a very clear line on it. If you do not, I predict with absolute certainty that you will continue to erode public sympathy with people who need the sympathy the most, because these things will be rubbed together and elided. So I would suggest, first of all, find that and hold on to it pretty close. Second thing I would suggest, find a broad level of agreement, and there is a lot of this internationally now, that the best way to cope with the most serious situations is to keep people roughly in the area of the country for which they fled. It's much easier to look after them there. It's much easier to get international aid there. My own country, Great Britain, is, I think, the second largest donor of international aid within the regions of Syria. That should, I think, be one of the models for this, that we make sure that we don't have this idea that some people have that you disperse X percentage there and X percentage there and put these people there. Thirdly, I would say make sure you increase economic productivity in refugee camps. Make sure people have a hope and a purpose and a work life when they're outside of their country. Look, I'm concluding with this because otherwise the music will get so loud you won't hear me. There are no simple answers to this, because there are no simple questions in this. This whole business does not give itself to sound bites, but it does need a much deeper debate than most of us have been willing to have so far. Thank you.
All right.
You'll see this will really ruffle the host. The fact that he said you cannot bring in the developing world into the developed world. It's like the old saying goes, bring in the third world, become the third world. And we see it. I'm not saying that everybody that comes in from economic crises and war-torn countries are bad people. I'm not even saying that most of them are. What I'm saying is that there's many examples in many countries of this going the wrong way. You hear the saying in America often, well, you know, Mexico doesn't send their doctors, or Africans don't send their doctors. Would you want them to anyway? If there's a doctor from a poor country, from a war-torn country, would he be best served going to Canada or Great Britain or America, or would he be best served staying in his home country and helping that country grow? But like Douglas Murray just said, it's a complicated issue and there's a big gray area, but you need to have borders. This idea that you shouldn't have borders and just let everybody in is insane, and it doesn't work. Crime rate goes up, rape goes up. These people have to assimilate into countries that they are not necessarily accustomed with the laws, the way of life, the culture. And we're seeing it now. We're seeing what's happening in Ireland, in Sweden, England, America. It can work, but on a mass scale, it is not working at the moment. I feel for people who come from war-torn countries and economic struggles, but we need a better solution than what we have now, because it's just absolutely not working. Because the fact of the matter is, a lot of these people that come to the West, which is the countries that people want to go to, right? Because you can prosper in America, in Canada, in England. You can come there with nothing, and if you make a series of great decisions, as we've seen throughout the years with, the Asian Americans, you can create generational wealth. But what's happening now is we're letting everybody in without properly vetting them, and some of these people are coming there. They hate us. They hate our values. They hate our Christianity. They hate the West. So why are we allowing these people to come into our countries? Let's get back to it.
Douglas Murray, thank you very much. A few provocative thoughts, no doubt, that you mentioned there. A few jumped at me, such as when you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. You seem to conveniently forget that the developed world moved to the developing world without asking permission.
No, I don't.
Said that,
I don't.
It seems to me as well that this is a particularly Western-centric viewpoint, and a misleading one at that, because you know as well as I do, and the figures show it, 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, settle in neighboring countries in the Middle East,
Sure.
in Africa and Asia. They do not rush over to Europe.
Sure. You'd make a big mistake if you think I hadn't heard of colonialism.
You don't seem to address it in any
I'd
way.
also suggest, by the way, that I don't know how long we're going to go on about colonialism for. I'm happy to do it as long as you like. But let
don't
me
we
just
have to be factful, though?
Well,
Don't we have to be
But also, don't think,
careful about
don't
facts,
think, if
about
I may say
history?
so, that colonialism was just a Western thing. What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history but the Ottoman Empire? Do we say that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with
That's
this?
not the issue. You
brought up colonialism.
You are talking about the Western view that they should stay where they belong.
I'm saying that it seems to me to be much wiser that if you have a very large humanitarian crisis in, for instance, Syria, you try to make sure that people remain in the area. This isn't say all of them, but it is more likely. I absolutely agree they do. I've seen it firsthand.
Look at Turkey, 3.5 million refugees. Look at Lebanon and Jordan per capita.
What
the
I'm
countries that have
suggesting
the
to you
most. In
is-
fact, in Lebanon, you've got 1 in every 4 person living in that country is a Syrian refugee.
Absolutely.
So to suggest they're not doing very much is just being misleading, being dishonest.
Believe me, I'm not being misleading. And I said from the outset that I agree with the point that most refugees remain in the area. And I said that I think that that's a good idea. I'm suggesting to you that I think it's better that people, for instance, fleeing Syria, end up in the countries around Syria in order to be able to return to their country than putting them in
But
Norway.
they will return. You are suggesting that they don't want to return. Who, in their right
I'm not
mind, if
suggesting
they
they
had
don't
the
want to return.
option,
When did I
and
say
we will
that?
hear from a refugee, if they had the option to return, of course they'd want to return.
I didn't say they wouldn't.
They leave everything behind. But you seem to also be oblivious to another important fact that I just want to throw at you before we go to a video clip that I want to show you. It's, what about the moral responsibility, though, of Western countries that have contributed to the destabilization of the region, the meddling, the military interventions, not to mention the arms sales that continue as we speak? What about
Do you want me to answer that? Okay, I'll answer that one frankly. Nobody denies, for instance, the disaster of Iraq. But who are the people who intervened most in Syria?
Isn't just Iraq.
Hang on. Let me answer it. Who intervened most in Syria? It wasn't America. It wasn't Britain. It's Iran, Russia. It's, among others, countries, including the one we're in and others
You're
around
deflecting.
the Gulf
Before we got to
Let's
Syria,
face
we
it,
had
that
Iraq, we had Libya, we had many
countries in this
instances.
neck of the woods were much more involved in the Syrian civil war than my country was.
Well, you're also
so do
pouring
you want to
money
take
at
some
it, aren't you?
responsibility for that? Do
I
you want to
think-
take more
I think
refugees
blame
here
can
in Qatar?
certainly
Do you
can
want to
go
take
around.
more in the Gulf?
No one
Right.
is immune to any sort of criticism.
well,
but we're talking
I'm
about
glad to hear
the
it.
Western countries, the British countries, the British.
What did Britain do in Syria?
We're talking about these governments that you seem to suggest should be immune.
No,
or
when did I
should be
suggest that?
absolved of any
When
responsibility.
did I suggest that?
I want to get to the other point that you make, and it's an important one, Douglas Murray. You suggest that we need to actually balance between two very important virtues, two important concepts of mercy toward the refugee and justice toward your own citizens. Let's take a quick look at this instance involving refugees.
Do you send anyone for us? We are the Syrians, about 300.
Sir, I give you the number of Malta authority because you are near Malta.
Hello?
Yes.
About 100 children and 100 women and maybe 100 men. Please hurry. Water is coming into it. The boat is going down. We are dying. 300
Yes, you
children.
You have called Malta. You have called Malta.
Don't throw us. You can run away.
Call Malta. Call Malta.
I have no enough account on the mobile. It will cut. Please. You have
Yes.
my number now. You call me, you please.
A very chilling video, though I don't suggest that you respond on behalf of the Coast Guard, the Italian Coast Guard. But again, it's that same issue of shifting the problem to others. And just for a little bit of context, in fact, this boat, which capsized 5 hours after this call, killing quite a few people on board, we heard that there were about 100 women, 100 children on board, that was twice as close to an Italian island as it was to Malta. But again, this idea that, we have to safeguard our values, where does mercy fit in that? Not just mercy, but the obligation, the legal obligations of states towards refugees.
I'd suggest that we all make sure we don't shift responsibility. There is a responsibility to everyone. That would include the state we're standing in now, wouldn't it? It would include all the states in this region. It would include the brother states. It would include the Ummah. It would include everybody. It wouldn't just be the Italians. Now, the Italians, by the way, and let me just finish this point.
That's a valid issue, but let me respond to it.
Let me finish the point.
States of the region, it's a valid issue. But unlike the European countries, allow me to just make this point, unlike the European countries,
I'll respond to 2 points.
They are not parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So the legal obligations are, well, it's just a fact.
Conveniently, isn't it?
But I'll let you carry on.
But this means that countries that are signatories to the Refugee Convention get more blame and more assumption that they are going to have to hold more of the burden than countries that didn't. And I'm suggesting to you that nobody should be able to absolve themselves from blame. But if you go to Italy now, and I don't know when you were last there, but it is not the case that this is going well in Italy, either for the migrants who are arriving or for the Italian population.
Isn't it because the resources are not being poured into this? Let's face it, the policies are not there, the resources aren't there.
I see these people when they arrive, I follow their stories. It is not the case just that they don't, the local populations in Italy I've been to Lampedusa, I've seen the boats coming in. The local populations are extremely generous. They are extremely kind to the people. Most of the populations in Europe, let's just not have this idea that Europeans are somehow incredibly cold-hearted. Countries in Europe have taken in a lot of people, and they are trying to deal with a very big problem very swiftly.
But just putting the numbers in context, let me just mention this very briefly. 3 million people sought asylum in Europe between 2015 and 2016. That's a fraction of the population of Europe, which is 508 million.
And Germany and Sweden took in 3% of the population in 1 year alone. So we're not talking about negligible numbers, and you shouldn't pretend that we are.
Not across the board, certainly. Douglas Murray, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That host lady is quite biased and annoying with the interruptions. I mean, man, let the guy talk. She asks a question and just strawmans him. As soon as he has an answer, just cuts him off to try to push her point of view. And she does that the whole way through. As you saw, she just cuts him off. And she tells Douglas Murray, well, the countries that you've mentioned were not part of this convention, so that's why they're not helping. And he said, well, isn't that convenient? Exactly. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Western countries offer more and more aid, and what do you hear from people? Well, you can just do more, you're not doing enough, you're doing this, you're doing that, but yet these other countries are not doing anything. They're in Doha right now, and they don't take many refugees. And we talk about accepting people, right? Accepting religion, accepting refugees and migrants. But for example, in a place like, do you really think they would accept any of these crazy LGBTQ ideologues? Absolutely not. That would not be accepted in any way, shape, or form. We all have our ideologies and our cultures, and look, I don't hate on them for that. I think in the West, we've lost a lot of that. We should stand up for Christianity and for what we believe in a little bit more. In his book, The War on the West and The Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray actually talks about this, where he talks about England losing its identity because of mass immigration. And places like the U.S. are places that, unlike any place in the world, you can just show up, you can get a job, you can work there, and you can become an American. And once you become an American, you're just accepted as an American. You're an American. There's not many countries like that. It's a big melting pot of cultures. I live in Southeast Asia. I can never become a citizen here. Well, I guess I can, but I'll never be accepted as a local. Now, she played that video for Douglas Murray to, try to make the Italians look bad and look, like he said, if you go to Lampedusa, if you go to Italy right now, the amount of African migrants that you see there, it's unrecognizable from even 5 years ago. And to say that Western countries have not done enough, if you look at Sweden, if you look at England, if you look at Ireland, they've changed their demographic completely. She said they don't have enough infrastructure to deal with it. They're not doing enough. The number one name for a male baby born in Ireland these days is Mohammed. Tell me they're not doing enough. Tell me that they're not taking enough people in. Let's get back to the video.
Actually, one thing that I noticed on Twitter, people engaged a lot with what you said directly to Douglas Murray. I think you made the point that you said you must you must be forgetting, you said, that the developed world moved into the developing world without their permission. That's got a lot of tweets, GIFs, and memes that have been circulating online. So we've got a lot of engagement. I still want to know what you think. Twitter, #DearWorld. Get in touch with me and I'll read your comments online. Ghida, back to you.
Thanks so much, Niloufar. Very interesting to hear. We'll come back to you, of course, a little later. But I understand we have the results. Let's put them up and see how the different statements have played out with our audience, both here and online. Do we have a clear winner, so to speak? Well, we've got a couple of positions that got more than the third one. Resist, power, pushback. That was Lamont Hill. That's almost 40% of your votes. Then education. Education, hope. What we heard from Muzoon, about 34.7% of the vote. And keep justice and mercy in balance. Some people have bought into this argument, Douglas Murray, some haven't, as you might expect. But quite a close call, though, I have to say. It wasn't like one statement or one argument won over everyone's votes.
I'm Mohamed Abu Hawash. I'm a senior at Georgetown University. And my question is to Mr. Douglas Murray. And before I ask my question, I just want to say, you said no sound bites, but then you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. I don't know what that's about.
I said it before.
My question is, since you brought up migration from the developing world, I'd like to ask you this. Every year, the developed world sends about $300 billion of aid to the developing world, but the developing world sends back trillions in debt repayments to the developed world. Now, don't you think that this is the main reason why migrants are moving to Europe? Because money is moving out of the developing world. Wealth is leaving the developing world and moving to the developed world, to build on what Lamont Hill said. Don't you think this is why people are moving to the Western world, to the developed world?
Well, no, I don't. Again, I repeat the fact there are no simple answers. And if it was simply the fact that you could, I don't know, do a debt default or something and solve the whole migration issue, then that would be great. But it just isn't the case. You think that if for instance, all African countries were allowed to default on debt, that they'd become burgeoning, flourishing societies? You think that the problem across, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa isn't just unbelievable greed and theft by politician after politician? You think that if you just wrote off the debt, that would stop being an issue and everyone would become transparent and clean in their dealings with money? I mean, the problems are much deeper than this. They're much deeper than just a simple solution like that. As, if I may just add quickly to the previous two comments, the late, very distinguished American diplomat Daniel Patrick Moynihan had a wonderful rule he came up with, known as Moynihan's Law, where he said that human rights, claims of human rights violations often happen in exactly inverse proportion to human rights violations. That is, you hear about them in the countries that are most free. And before long, you can end up with the presumption that the most free countries are the ones who are most abusive of human rights. And this happens with the case when we talk about our leaders and the ones. It's all very well. We can talk about the Trump administration. We can talk about the democracies and so on for all we like. We can all make criticisms, and we all should. But, okay,
briefly,
Mr. Putin. What are you going to do about him? What are you going to do about the mullahs in Iran? What are you going to do about the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia? You see, what we end up with is this situation. We go, oh, Mr. Trump. We can all do that. Believe me, I can riff on Trump
again, you're being
all
quite
day.
selective, aren't you?
What are you going to do about the people you can't do anything about? Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to give them a pass? Or are you just going to enjoy beating up on the democracy?
I hate to have to interrupt you. There's something called democracy, though, isn't there? Elections.
For sure.
Mark, quickly before I go to another question.
No. We can go to another question.
Okay, let's go to another question, please.
So I'm going to talk briefly about, my mother's experience as an immigrant, and I want to touch on something that Lamont Hill said, this power of education and telling people how refugees fit into the wider context of economic development. Here's why I'm very skeptical about that. Because when my mother arrived in the UK and her parents arrived in the UK, people still called them dirty packies. When she had graduated from Oxford University, she was still a brown person who was not seen as a citizen, right? So to what extent can we really sell this idea that being educated or fitting X, Y, and Z criteria is what you need to do as a refugee for people to humanize you. The inherent problem with these people is that they don't humanize you. You can't fulfill your oppressors' criteria so that they see you as human. So how do you humanize people?
Dehumanizing refugees, thank you very much. And with this, let me go to you, Douglas Murray, because much of your argument, Douglas, seems to be about the us versus them, the fact that, you know, we have our own values, our own Britishness, our own virtues, and they will come to our shores with their values, their traditions. You seem to almost suggest that they come to your countries with a lesser breed of values.
No, I don't think I said that at any point, and that's another time you've tried to put something in my mouth.
So when you talk about the difference in values, what do you suggest?
Look, first of all, I didn't say that. I said that there are challenges because we do know that there are challenges, and let's just be frank about this. I mean, for instance, I've been in the Gulf for the last week or so. I see more burqas in my home city of London than I have seen in the Gulf in recent days, certainly here in Doha. Now, I can't say I'm delighted by the sight of more and more burqas in London. Do I feel any hatred of the people who wear them? Of course not. Of course not. But I can't say I'm elated by it. And definitely there are times I think, you know, what percentage of burqas in this area becomes like not that pleasant for everyone else.
But again, is it all down to burqas? Because again, you're not asking people with other traditions whether they care about the sight of people drinking alcohol or going up in bikinis. Again, it's a very
we could in Britain
Western-centric viewpoint.
I'm not. I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen. These things are all a bit of give and take.
But you bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
Well,
they don't.
Yeah, there are, as I said, and before we got all confrontational, which you did from the get-go, I said what the problem is here is that these things are all rubbing against each other. And in that situation, you have to work out what things you're willing to give up, which things you're willing to compromise on, and which ones you're not. You're not going to persuade the Brits to massively change their culture, but let me just make the point. Every single society has certain aspects of it doesn't want to give up. This one will. In Qatar, this one will. Everyone does. So please don't try to make this a kind of bigoted European thing. That would be a very, very dishonest way to. That would be a very dishonest way to represent
this debate. Just answer this question
debate.
directly if you can. Which of your values are you most afraid to lose? Which ones are most threatened by
freedom
the
of
arrival
speech.
of refugees?
Freedom of speech. It's the first one. Oh, you think that's not a problem?
I mean,
you think that's not a problem?
But
you think? Sorry, no. Let me pick up on that. Let me pick up on that. It's very easy to snigger. It's very easy to snigger about this until you've had friends shot in a newspaper office. It's very easy to laugh about that until it's happened to people you know.
Right, but she's actually quite rude. She's actually quite rude when she talks to Douglas Murray. It's quite annoying to watch. But imagine being a migrant from a war-torn country, and you're going to be assimilating into a new country. When you say, well, I'd like you to take me in with your taxpayer dollars, but also I need you to change your culture, and I got to stop drinking to appease me. That's not the way it works. When in Rome, I no longer live in the West, and I have to live by the laws of the country that I am living in. They would not be changing their ways of life for me. As well, they shouldn't. The same way the people of Qatar would never change their way of life for anybody. But for this lady to sit there and say, well, you guys are not doing enough to make these people feel welcome, feel at home. There's a reason that people want to move to the West. It is the land of opportunity. You do have free speech. You can have generational wealth. Women have rights. It's easy for these people to shit on the West when they come from a country that actually does nothing really for migrants and refugees. Americans, Europeans, Canadians do more than any other countries in the world when it comes to refugees and migrants. And look at what's happening now. Statues are being torn down in the West. Abraham Lincoln was torn down. We change our values, we change our infrastructure, not necessarily for immigration or for refugees or for migrants, but because of it. This has generational impact on a society. This changes the whole demographics of a country when you have it at this scale. And if you look at the Labour Party in England, all these people who in the 90s, the early 2000s that were pushing mass migration, I thought that this was the best thing to ever happen, now have all recanted and changed their minds on the topic and saying that, well, maybe that was a bad idea. And looking at all of the statistics surrounding it, it was 100% a bad idea. Let's get back to it.
I'm from Kenya. And my question is to you, Douglas. So you talked about people us serving justice, and do you think it's judicious for these people in Britain, for example, you talked about how Britain is giving aid to these countries in Africa. It's judicious for them to give this much money to these countries, but without even listening to their needs. So this only contributes to the white savior complex that is currently a big issue in
this
Africa.
whole notion of charity as opposed to policy.
Well, there is a saying we have, damned if you do and damned if you don't. If it's the case that if we don't give aid, we'd be accused of not giving aid, and if we do give aid, it's a white savior complex. I mean, we can all give aid better, for sure, and I just gave, in my opening remarks, what I think was a serious suggestion for one very good use of aid, which is to prioritize it in the region and in the neighboring countries of places people are fleeing from. But I mean, as I say, I would refuse as well to see the multifarious problems that exist in your own home country and sadly across the continent of Africa. I refuse to say that that's, you know, because of foreign aid only. It's so many things have gone wrong there, and you know that better than I do.
Hear what Mark Lamont Hill said there at Douglas Murray right at the end. He said, crazy white people. When Douglas Murray said, well, people are walking around with guns, you know, afraid. Yeah, crazy white people. Let me tell you something, Mark Lamont Hill. The black population of the U.S. is 14%. 7% of those are men. Men commit most of the crimes. So let's use 7%. 7% of the population of America committing 50% of the crimes. And not just 50% of the crimes, but almost 70% of all violent crimes. Not white people. And people have a right to be afraid. Look what happened in Paris at Charlie Hebdo. Douglas Murray referred to this earlier in the video, where a crazy Muslim went into the newspaper and shot up the place and killed people because a cartoonist had made a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad. Freedom of speech is important. Are most people that come to a country violent criminals? No. Are some? Yes. Do people have a right to be afraid? Yes. Do people have a right to think like, I don't want my neighborhood to change. I'm happy with my neighborhood, how it looks. Yes, absolutely. When you get liberal people like Mark Lamont Hill that say, well, you guys are just crazy. That'll never happen. You're just crazy. That's not the way you go about appeasing a society. Let's get back to it.
Murray, we've been saying that governments have failed, policies have failed. On an individual level, what can we do? What will you do differently thinking about this issue?
Firstly, by the way, migrants versus expats, there's a very clear reason. It's expected, rightly or wrongly, that expats don't stay in the country and bring up their families and stay for generations. The assumption with migrants is, currently has been in recent generations, that they are going to stay and that it's going to be a multi-generational thing. That's the assumption. But it's an interesting and important thing. Very quickly, just on the integration thing, I repeat, I think we've got to be very, very careful that we don't end up lambasting the freest and most generous countries. And I would just urge, as a call to, as it were, moral caution on this, urge you in this room and people watching, how many people have you made citizens of Qatar from Syria? How many? Okay, it's something worth thinking about, isn't it?
All right.
Well said, Douglas Murray. Don't throw stones when you live in a glass house. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, help it grow, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Peace out, everybody.